This session is going to be slightly looser and different, and hopefully getting some Q&A for you. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to just give you a little bit of data on the funding situation. I was privileged, I should also say I was president of my 5th grade class. So that's another important presidency. I wanted to give you some
Put it on the website.
I wanted to give you some data. I was fortunate enough to have been invited to APA's Science Leadership Conference 3 weeks ago, where they basically ram a lot of policy talks in your face for a day and then send you off to lobby Congress for particular issues, which was a wonderful experience, and anyone who gets a chance to do it should do it. But part of it is they gave us a little bit of the skinny on the NIH funding situation, and I just wanted to share it with you because as you're going to see, it's feast and famine, and these slides are courtesy of Pat Kobor, who is one of the people in APA's Office for Public Policy, who does a lot of the advocacy for science for public interest, not for clinical practice. And I'll move over to here for now. Oh no, we're going to see if this wireless thing actually works. This is so high-tech for CUNY. Okay, so this is the image that I want you to sort of sit with for the whole panel. What's this from? Okay, so this is the car going off the cliff. And the guiding metaphor they left with us at this APA Science Conference was really, don't let NIH funding go off the cliff. I'll see if this works. And as I said, there's sort of a feast and famine kind of mentality here. That what's happened is, over the past years, we could really say there's been a doubling of the NIH budget between 1998 and 2003, and we have the stimulus grants that Obama put in, which were fabulous last year. But really, what's happening is there are sub-inflation increases. That NIH lost, it estimates it lost about 12% of its purchasing power between 2003 and 2009. So budget doubled. We were all really happy. The NIH budget's sitting at about $30 billion, but because of inflation, it's actually less money than it looks. So right now, so then there was sort of this sense of famine, then Obama passes the stimulus legislation, and all of a sudden, there's a huge amount of grants going on right now. So if you look at these data, just from 1995 projecting out to 2010, you can see in terms of current dollars, there's sort of been an increase, but constant dollars, the brown line is dropping. Those purple bars are the stimulus funds. And basically, let me just give you how many grants. I was supposed to have memorized this, but I didn't 2 weeks ago. That basically there was an extra $10.4 billion in funds to be spent off over the 2-year period. Did any of you do stimulus funds? I didn't. Nothing I do qualified for it. They received more than 20,000 applications, but they funded only 840 projects. So that's a 4%, that's only 4% of the people. Everybody killed themselves in May and June to try to get a piece of this money. Now that's not to say anything bad about the stimulus funds, because they worked with infrastructure in the country, but in terms of research, it was actually a small amount, but they're now counting that in, saying, look at this immense increase in the budget, but in reality, in 2 years, it's gone. So one of the important things is just that, let me keep going through, that you're gonna see what's gonna happen is we're gonna start having a real drop again in NIH funding. That isn't to scare you at all. That's simply for us to be able to realize that funding is sort of the bread that we eat, the water that we swim in, and funding is always gonna go up and down. But it's an important skill, an important part of our profession for us to be able to garner research funds, to be able to do the kind of research that all of us here want to do. So let me turn this. Let me start by throwing out, I'm going to move from sort of top down to bottom up in this panel. We're going to start with sort of big questions and issues and then move down to more specifics and tactics and strategies. We have about an hour and a half. Not everybody can stay the whole hour and a half, so I wanted to really cover the big things first. So let me throw this one out to the whole panel, and you know it's coming. Who funds policy research? And actually, what do we mean by policy research for everybody sitting in the room?
Are we being transparent?
Anybody who wants to jump in can.
I would define policy research, so just make sure we're on the same page, as having a combination of being intervention focused, trying to change something, change a social problem or policy. Typically, policy research is done in large samples and answers a discrete policy question. That means it has to be, I think, I mean, there's a lot of research that I think that's very relevant for policy, and that's a different question, actually. But the most relevant for policy are things that are really scalable interventions, right? Something that actually could be conducted on a large scale. I also think there's, again, a lot of scientific research that's very important for informing policy decisions, that's descriptive, and I think is incredibly important to the scientific community. I think that policy research is special because what it is, it really is trying to answer a causal question about the effects of a particular policy or intervention approach. And I think that's so important because if you're out there speaking to policymakers trying to make a case for a policy decision, you want to be on the strongest sort of legs possible to really be able to say that you're very confident that whatever results you're talking about are really due to the policy or intervention you're studying, rather than including all of the caveats that are very important to do in a scientific discussion or a scholarly discussion. In terms of who funds, so that's a little bit on sort of how I would define policy research. In terms of who funds it, I mean, I include the gamut from private foundations, the federal government. There's private foundations like the William T. Grant Foundation, like the Spencer Foundation, like Smith-Richardson Foundation, Andy Casey Foundation. There are local foundations like Robin Hood in New York that may fund program-related costs, if not the research-related costs. There's others I could mention. I think the federal government funds policy research. Both there's federal grants as well as contracts, and we can talk about the distinction between the two. And I think both are very relevant for pursuing if you're going to be doing policy research. Is that?
No, I don't think that was, just took care of it. No. I mean, I'm coming from a very different background because the work I do is not, I mean, it's looking at policies, but it's probably more policy relevant research. And I would say, don't rule out NSF would be my argument here. Is, they're going to be less likely to fund policy research as you defined it, but certainly you can spin research on policy in a way that they will bite, but you have to be careful about how you do it. So for me, lots of research is policy research, if you more broadly define it as something that can inform policy and make suggestions about what types of policy we might want to pursue. And so that opens up your funding opportunities a lot more.
I think for me, the distinction that Pam made between policy research and policy relevant research is critical. And I think you're really talking about policy relevant research.
Absolutely, yeah.
And not that's sort of out there doing it. So I think Pam's distinction is really critical. And I think it's hard to see places that say they fund policy research. So there's not a lot of people that advertise we fund policy research per se, but there are some, they don't even call it that. So in Health and Human Services, you wouldn't be at NIMH, but you could be at ACF, where they're really funding.
ACF is?
Administration for Children and Families.
I always get it wrong. It used to have youth in there, but
Right, yeah.
so they're doing large-scale experiments. So, for example, they're doing all these Bush-based experiments where he was trying to get people of color to get married so that they would stay together. But there's a huge, and they wouldn't have all these bad things happen. But there's a huge amount of money that they're doing. It came from a presidential mandate. They've got these randomized cluster trial experiments in many cities with thousands of people, and there's about 4 different ones going on. But what they're basically looking at, and this is the kind of thing that ACF does that NIMH wouldn't do, or any of the NIHs, it's basically impact evaluation. Did it work or didn't it? And you find in many of those kind of things, more often economists are involved in that. So there's a whole bunch of economists who do that kind of thing. And psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists have gotten more involved, but they're looking at a little different piece of the pie. And Pam has done some of that, and that's the foundation. We don't fund policy research per se. We fund intervention research. But we're interested basically not simply in the individuals, we're interested in their outcomes, but we're interested in how does some new policy, conditional cash transfer, for example, impact the daily life in a family or the daily life in a school. So we'll fund people, and we do sort of add-on or embedded studies to federal money. They're doing these big field experiments. We do the add-on to get inside to see how that policy impacts the family and how it changes their child rearing and ultimately impacts the kid.